Okay, so hello everyone. You are welcome to our weekly discussions, if I may say. I don't want to call it a podcast because it is work in progress, but I hope we shall reach there. My name is Erisa Sserwadda, and I'm here on behalf of Africa Speaks, where we look into issues that are affecting the African continent as a whole, and of course, those from within the continent and also from outside the continent. But we look at the issues which are at the heart of our African society. So today we are going to dive into something that is actually shaping the whole continent, but also something that is shaping the whole world at large. And it is inspired by different perspectives, those which are informed by the academia and also those which are informed by real world experiences. So we are going to dive into something that is way beyond our practice, but we shall try to digest it in a more clear and consumable way to ensure that we can all get out of this podcast today with a clear understanding of how the global battle between different narratives are trying to shape the way how societies are being constructed, the way how power is interplaying between big states and of course small states, and what this means to the common people within these societies. So we see that today when we talk about powerful countries, it goes beyond the economic power, it goes beyond military power. Nowadays, many people are speaking about culture. They are speaking about the stories which hide behind these structures. Usually, I think traditionally we have known power in terms of being militarily strong or being economically strong, but we are seeing countries and nations which are rising on the premises of culture and stories and how they frame themselves or how they portray themselves. So those are some of the things that we are going to bring at the forefront of the discussion today when we see powerful countries like China and USA fighting over powers which are beyond the traditional wars that we know, but fighting over power in form of narratives, who says what, who controls what. So all of those, and oftentimes these have implications for not only these two big countries that we are seeing interplaying, but they also have implication to countries, for instance, in Africa, where we come from. So that's why we roll the ball back to these countries and chip in, trying to understand how these narratives are shaping the world and of course how they are impacting the developing countries. I'm joined by two colleagues as usual, Brook from Ethiopia and also Mr. Bakpa from Ghana. You are most welcome, and please, upon your permission, I would like you to allow me to start by framing the conversation as I have already framed it, and take this pressure to invite the first guest. I think I will invite Mr. Bakpa. I would like you to chip in and offer us your perspective, but of course, I will not give you a question, but I'll just give you a few speaking points. I want you to weigh in terms of African urgency. How does Africa, in terms of, Africa is big, over 54 countries or 55, some say, but how does Africa fit into these narratives in terms of the ideological definitions? Because we see US setting the stage, China also setting the stage, but where does Africa stand? African countries. Is there a sense of African countries also trying to influence the narratives on this global stage? Do you see any African agency interplaying here? I'm talking in terms of Africa because we can't start mentioning specific countries. We are talking about China, we are talking about US, all big global, economic powers, militarily strong and culturally strong, because Chinese or Mandarin is spoken all over most of the Asian countries, and now we have it being taught in even African countries. We are speaking in English, which is the official language of USA, which is an identity, in fact, which traces back to them. But when we talk about Africa, we see a more of a fragmented continent. I think there are few countries which have a common language. When you talk about West Africa, where Mr. Bakpa you come from, there are a lot of languages. I mean, you have a few francophone countries which are speaking French, but also have other countries which are speaking different languages. Same happens in East Africa, same happens in South Africa. Do we see African agents here, and how can maybe Africa try to come in also with a different ideology? Do you see Africa coming in with a different ideology, or Africa is just being consumed by these two big powers? So, Mr. Bakpa, please, the floor is yours. Chip in, and if you wish, you can also try to share with us some of the ideological underpinnings which I really like that are coming from one of the forefathers of your home country, Kwame Nkrumah. He warned us about neocolonialism long time ago in 1950s, 1960s. Is it something that has eaten up Africa? Because we have seen a lot of articles and publications are choosing China and USA as being agents of neocolonialism. Do you see us being fallen prey of this, something that was warned to us a long time ago? So I will leave you and give you the floor. I mean, I can speak until tomorrow, but you just chip in and offer your views. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's that I totally understand. It's an interesting topic, and there's always the edge to talk more about it because there are a lot of talking points to it. Yeah, I think one thing you have to realize about all these things is that Africa must use China as some sort of what we call the specimen of the experiment. We see that in the 70s, 50s, when the world order was being built, China was just a random country like Africa. Nobody gives much attention to it. So everybody was like, okay, it's fine. Do trade with them. People were doing trade with them. They were doing trade with them because they think that these people are never going to get ahead of us. So we are always going to get the advantage to do whatever we want to do. And now we are seeing what is playing out. Now that these countries have come, the West have come to realize how China has industrialized, and now they're accusing China of flooding their markets with Chinese goods. But what is the essence of the globalization we've been building from the 50s, from right after the Second World War, is to make sure that we have variety of consumer goods within countries. Something that is produced in the US, you can see it as far as in South Africa. Something that is produced in France can be seen as far as in Vietnam. That's the whole idea of globalization. So what sense does it make to now accuse another country of flooding your market with its goods? So I say this to say that Africa now, they see us as not being relevant. Why do I say so? Just listen to when you listen to the Donald Trump speech at the UN, you realize that he mentioned Europe for more than I can't even count, but in not a single case did he mention Africa. Just recently, there's Politico, this American news article released some WhatsApp chats about top government officials, somebody who has been appointed to a top government position. You know what he said about Africa? He said Africa is a shithole continent and Africa will continue to be so. These are just things you have to understand how these people view Africa. Is just reading some of these things. You know, some politicians are not well because we have political language and we have language. So because of political language, outwardly they will praise us, they will say all manner of things. But inside, just like what has been revealed, it's a private chat, private group. Nobody sees it. And that's where you learn the true intention of how they believe the kind of people we are. So it's kind of telling you people that telling us as a continent that if you don't build ourselves and continue to think that, oh, these people are progressing, we have to open everything so that we all enjoy the globalization. A time is coming. The time is here now. They will disregard you. They will just see you as nothing, and there's total disrespect of who you are. So I'm saying that to position ourselves as a strong continent, or to even promote our culture to others, what we have to do is to grow economically. If you have the economic power, people are ready to listen to you. That's all that matters. If you have the economic power, your culture will be able to go to others. Now we don't, Africa, do we have a Netflix? Do we have streaming services that stream our culture such that people here will watch and learn more about us? No. What they all think about is that I one time read an article where the person was arguing strongly, and I kind of agree with him after reading that people in the West believe that their culture is supreme and the whole world must adopt their culture. And we see that everywhere because now the whole world kind of revolve around their culture. You must be democratic. That's what they say, and that's where we are now. Or every other thing you can think about is now what we are adopting. So to just summarize everything, the bottom line of what I'm saying is that Africa, we must see China where it is now and what is happening to China as lesson to us. We must build our economy such a way that we are not so much reliant on them. We must build our own culture and be so proud of it that we don't have to feel that we have some sort of inferior culture. We must be proud of who we are, and from there they will start to respect us. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Very interesting. Thank you for that those opinions, because you have offered a couple of very strong points, which I absolutely have to agree with you on a couple of points you mentioned. China, yes, in 1950s, 1960s, when you look at the data, it shows that we are almost at the same levels of development economically in terms of GDP and other measures. We are almost at the same, suffering the same kind of political atmospheres, but at the present things have been different, you know. But I think you have mentioned it very well that these countries, especially economically and geopolitically, they have dominated us. But I also must say that, although you didn't mention it, but I'm trying to rephrase your conversation to say that you absolutely agree with what Nkrumah warned us a long time ago, that we may fall prey of the neo-colonialism from these people. They have dominated us, and they have dominated us not only economically and politically with their ideologies, but also mentally. They have taken us over. You talked about Netflix and other Western cultures that have, dominated our society and, overshadowed our own cultures to the extent that we admire and emulate everything from their own culture at the expense of our own culture. So this is, I must say that it is the colonization of ideology. So they have influenced the narrative to the extent that we hate our own narratives, we hate our own ideologies, we hate our own ideas, and we are in love of their own ideas, and that's why we can't escape them. So very nice, very interesting arguments, and I would like now to move over to Brooke. Brooke, I want you to weigh in, going through the same direction. I know you are not a journalist, but of course, I want you also to continue in this line, and you tell us, how do you see this in terms of the media space? Because the way how we have been blessed to the extent that we have seen these countries in reality, we have lived in their societies. And I mean, it goes back to this someone who said, you see, we believe what these societies are by the way how they portray themselves. When you look at what is portrayed in their media, sometimes it doesn't picture out the real vision of how these countries look. So there is how they market themselves in the media, and that's how they have managed to continue the narratives of influencing the ideas, of influencing the mental sovereignty, because they give out or they put out what they want the world to see, and the way how they want the world to see it, and that's how they have continued to influence us beyond the economic power and the politics, but the way how they illustrate their cultures. So I want you to also to weigh in terms of the media. How has this been interdependent, and how independent is it in terms of the Western dominance and framing of issues, the way how they frame Africa? Because and in fact, as Abdul mentioned that he read an article, sometimes they say things about Africa depending on what they have read about Africa in books. Some of these fellows haven't even been in the continent. They haven't witnessed life here. They haven't experienced it, but they just see in the media and they read in the media. So I want you to weigh in terms of how do you see Africa's independence in terms of the media? Do we have our independent media that is able to portray Africa as it is, or it is still captured by this Western framing? And how does this impact Africa's standing in terms of influencing these narratives and ideologies at the global level? Brooke, over to you.
Brook, you are muted.
Yeah, sorry guys. Thank you, Erisa, again. I think you've raised a very interesting point, especially how the US is exporting its culture, is driving a certain type of narrative through mass media, and how not only the globe, but specifically Africa is prone to subversion of certain kinds driven by this media. So when we look at the ramifications for Africa, one would be we're increasingly seeing this tendency to try to replicate the media that exists in the US. So we're looking at increased access to news, increased access to information. So those things are to be celebrated in that regards. But I'm afraid most of those things are somewhat symbolic. So we have TV anchors that are on Prime TV, just like how the Americans do it. But when it comes to the media freedom, when it comes to press reporting, it couldn't be worlds apart. I mean, there's so much difference in how things play out on the ground, how the systems are structured. And I think it's quite unfortunate that you see, especially in the media arena, the tendency to try to replicate what works there, what exists there, without actually having the freedom of speech, without actually having the necessary ingredients of what makes for a free, fair media. But in addition to that is, I think, one thing that we also have to be very careful about is the type of narrative that we seem to be absorbing from the West, especially from the US, vis-a-vis China, and its effect on how Africans perceive the rest of the world, how they perceive Americans, how they perceive Chinese. So if you look at the media narrative and framing, it has always been, the Americans are like the white saviors and the Chinese are bad guys. And this goes back to all the American films and how they portray the Chinese as Chinese mafia. For example, you can take Chinatown in New York, a hotbed for crime, for organized crime, for malevolent existence, and all those things. And I think at this point in time, as we look at how things have unraveled in the last 30 or 40 years, I would say, Americans have become a victim of their own narrative. For so long, they've fed this narrative to their own people that, the Chinese, all there is to the Chinese is Chinatown, all there is to the Chinese is being a bad guy. And when China building this huge manufacturing base, when China was building this huge industrial base, the American public, and to be honest, the world at large, wasn't there to spectate. And I think, Africa would have learned one or two, I would say a lot of lessons from China if, we had our eyes on how they were growing, how they were developing, and all those things. So, everyone was looking towards the West for inspiration. But, China's experience, China's lived recent approach would have added much more value compared to the US or Europe for that matter. So now, from an African perspective, I think we can still learn. There is still a lot to learn, but I'm quite skeptical that we have the initiation to grab at the opportunity, because now we're seeing the US and China are tussling against each other, pushing back. But as a country, we have been spectators, especially for the West. We have been absorbing the media narrative. We've been purchasing their manufactured goods, and I think it's going to be a change in terms of where we're getting our manufactured goods. At one point, it was from the US. At one point, it was from Europe. Now it's going to be from China. But I don't think we've been smart enough to learn how to build our railways, whether it's France building a railway in Dakar, Senegal, whether it's France building a railway in Cairo that was inaugurated last year by President Macron, whether it's China building a railway in Kenya or Ethiopia, in this great competition for power, I think Africa has not been in a unique position to tap that opportunity to the growth of its continent, to the growth of its country. And I think the media narrative didn't really help Africa insofar as that Africans weren't able to see what China was undergoing, this huge transformation. So I think today the smoke is slowly clearing out, and people are starting to have a rough idea of what China is and how China came to be and what China offers. So I think this caricature of China, I mean, to quote the US Vice President J.D. Vance, I mean, he famously gave a speech about China in which he explained that they outsourced a lot of their manufacturing to China in a belief that Chinese peasants would be better off doing low-end manufacturing, and that they wouldn't ultimately graduate to the high-end manufacturing. I mean, that underestimation seems to have been their own undoing. So, I mean, we have to take it with a grain of salt, this particular narrative that's being pushed about the Chinese, how they're out to dominate the world, as if the US hadn't or isn't dominating the world as we speak right now. But I think if China is the next superpower, which I think it will be, looking at its trajectory, I think Africa should look beyond the media narratives and should cash on this opportunity. Not like how it used to be in terms of like inviting Chinese companies to build infrastructure, which is good in one way, but I don't think there has been a sufficient amount of learning in terms of technology diffusion, in terms of knowing the key know-how of how to do it. You can only learn by doing, and I don't think we've lived up to that opportunity. Thank you.
Very interesting, very interesting. I mean, you raised a couple of interesting issues, Brooke, which are all very relevant. You weighed in on how the media space has been shrinked, and also the way how we lived under the American umbrella, the hawks of capturing and undermining, or even not even understanding. Sometimes people prefer to refer to China as the big closed wall, like nobody even knew actually what was happening inside China until recently. And I think that's how China managed to build up its structures economically and militarily without the outside world knowing. And today China is growing out when everyone is just wondering where is this happening from. Everyone didn't know what was happening inside China, but it was two-way. Of course, with the dominance of the American influenced media saying this and that about China, and also China doing the contrary. And I think so. Bringing in the African perspective, I think that's where also Africa has failed. because Africa doesn't have these big medias to come out and counteract the narratives that are being thrown against Africa. So going back to our point of where we have seen an Africa which has been portrayed as the continent of crisis. There is less to little to nothing of the narratives outside there in the media that are portraying Africa as a place of creativity. I think this is something that is still lacking. We need now to have African media counteracting these narratives to give that other side of Africa, presenting Africa as a continent of creativeness. And also, this is where we are going. So when I try to summarize up what we have so far discussed and what we have raised, I still strongly believe that we still have, in terms of Africa, we still have that colonial camera. The way how Africa is viewed is still, being under the shadows of the colonial regimes which were existing in Africa, where there is no life in Africa. Everything is still there in the traditional stage. So and this is something I believe that we need to counteract. And I think I will refer to one of my lovely writers, Frantz Fanon. I think we all familiar about his writings when he was talking about decolonization, which I believe is a very interesting cause that African countries or as a continent we shall need. That we will not be free until we have managed to overcome the colonization of our mind. It always begins slowly by someone telling that if someone tells that you can't do this and you have it in your mind, even if you can do it, but when your mind believes that you can't do it because someone tells you can't, you will never do it. So we look at such a periods and also levels, I think, where Africa needs to reach to counteract all of those ideological and mental colonization that has been thrown over us, that you can't do this without America, you can't do this without US. I think this is something that China has managed to overcome, and this is something that is shocking, especially for the US when they look at China, because China can do anything without US intervention. In fact, now US wants to borrow some ideas and some technological advancement from China, but of course because of their superiority and other standards, they feel like they can't do that. So I want us to drive the discussion in this direction now of African debate of the mind. I want to bring in Abdul again. Abdul, I want you to weigh in terms of we are still on the independence of the mind and the intellectual independence. Do you think Africa has achieved intellectual independence in this case? Do you think we have independent minds on the continent at the moment in terms of, think about the education system, think about our policy frameworks? I also want to because I usually refer you informal as a professor. I want also to think in terms of the references, because we are now talking about the narrative. We are talking about the ideologies, what defines Africa, because as an African rising or emerging researcher and scholar, how often do you see African literature, African work, African scholarship being referenced vis-a-vis the Eurocentric, reference? And I think at the end of the day, this is what we believe, because if you go online and search maybe an article between about the economic emergence of China, you will find all of the writers and all of the publications, they are Eurocentric, and we can't deassociate, their own conviction from what they are putting in these articles. Look at the publishing houses. Look at, all of these things. How do we situate Africa in terms of intellectual independence? How do we see independence of Africa in terms of producing these works which are Afrocentric, which are carrying the Afrocentric point of reference? I was looking at a very interesting research that when you look at the source of research, and that actually one professor was presenting and he was showing the source of research of all these publications that are out there on the market, it is from Africa. But when you look at those who are producing or those who are publishing this like Africa is a source of information or is the center. So how can we the person who is studying Africa is from outside, they are going to offer an outside view, or what people usually like to refer as a Eurocentric, because most of the people are coming from Europe and Western countries. Abdul, can you please weigh in on this by looking at those aspects in terms of our education system, the policy frameworks? How often are our policies homegrown, or are they from within, or we try to emulate and model policies from outside the continent? So how independent are we on these aspects? And also in terms of the Pan-African knowledge, is it from within or it is from outside? I mean, a couple of issues, but just to weigh in. Thank you.
Yeah, the topic was being precise, and then you kept discussing, and it's like it's expanding way out. Yeah, just you were talking about media narrative. I wanted to come in there. There's actually this article on Bloomberg, and then I realized that there's another NGO in Africa who actually done similar research. Saying they call the article the prejudice premium. They realize that in actual sense, like prejudice about Africa actually cost us 75 billion on estimates annually. You can see this as they're able to quantify in terms of you see government borrowing. When our governments want to issue external debt, it means that they have to come to these people and borrow. But because these people, they've been programmed in a certain way to have this kind of prejudice about Africa, they fear that they may not be able to retrieve their money, so they tend to charge more for the premium, and so they call it the prejudice premium, and this tend to cost us 75 billion in excess. And then you can I don't know, but in was it in 2022 you realize that the president of Ghana and now the AU has taken over, saying that the rating companies, there are this Fish and other companies that rate economies to tell them your standard, and your rating tell you how much it will cost you to borrow from the external market, like to borrow from outside. So there's always the president of Ghana, who was the then president Akufo-Addo, has always said that it's like these agencies are not being fair to us. With any small twist in our economic events, you see a total downgrade of the economy. And this tends to put a lot of pressure in the government, because now it means that your cost of debt service will go higher, your cost of borrowing is going to go higher. So it becomes a big, big, big issue for the government. This is just on the media aspect before I even come to the academic whatever. At the same time, you realize that what we have to fight is what is common sense. Whoever define what common sense is hold everything, because when you want to say something, they'll be like, but this is the common sense, and everybody tends to believe that because that's what we've all been made to believe. So it's very difficult. We are now in a world where they are westernizing the global identity. You get it? If you are not westernized, you are seen as being barbaric. You are seen as being some sort of, I don't even know how to put it. So it's quite complicated. It's quite complicated. Now to talk about the academic world, are we really independent? In terms of, I say that knowledge is transferable. Knowledge can be learned from somewhere and then it's applicable in other parts of the world. It's just like what we call the external validity of research. It makes sense. And but my problem with that is that in the medical sciences, in the physical sciences, that is always true, because the medicine that cures in the US, like, obviously I don't know much about science, but it should work well in the African context as well. No problem with that. So if you're adopting their sciences and everything, it's fine because it's science. But on the other hand, you think about social sciences, because you realize that social science, there's one unique thing people don't understand about social sciences. It only functions because of the nature of the people. Because in most economic models and whatever, when you put in a policy, it depends on how the people react to the policy, which will determine the outcome of the policy, and not necessarily the policy itself. So a policy that is designed for a Western economy may not necessarily work for us. And so if we take things wholeheartedly, like if we take things, swallow everything and hook and line, is going to be trouble for us. So it is time we have to find our own identity in terms of what is knowledge.
What is knowledge? That is a
What is,
very
what is knowledge? And it has become a big issue. I had this discussion, like you said. There was this article that moves around, who the man was actually asking who win the Nobel Prize. And his argument is that there seem to be a gatekeeping. And there's the gatekeeping in a sense that there's a trend of knowledge and there's a trend of institutional hierarchy. If you are not among those things, you are not being recognized as contributing to the world knowledge. So we, those that are even in the African context, we are far detached from these things. Take for economics, for example. If you do your research as an African, if I do my research in Africa, where I grew up, where I understand the nitty-gritties, where I understand the nuances, still, if I want to publish that, I'm not going to publish in what we call a reputable journal because they don't trust me and they're not going to accept it. If I want it to be published, then I have to affiliate myself with another person who works in one of those gate institutions before it will be published there. So it becomes complicated. You see that, like you said, most of the data and everything they use for research tend to come from Africa, but different researchers. How does this make sense? You look at what we call in economics, they have what we call the randomized controlled trials. You see, when I was reading those things, I was really shocked to realize that most of these kind of experiments were conducted either in Kenya or Uganda, Kenya or Uganda, Kenya or Uganda. Over 50% of what I have read tend to come from those places. And I was asking myself, really? But that's the hard reality we have to cope with. Yeah.
exactly, Abdul. Let me cut you short, please, because you have said it all. You have said it all. You have really illustrated what I was talking about. This is the dilemma that we are in as Africa. This is the dilemma that we are in, and I would like also to call in Brook just to weigh in, because when you look what you have said it very well. All of the randomized controlled trials and all of the research that is being produced now, all of the Nobel Prizes that are being won, they are won over the data and research that is conducted within Africa. But all of these people who are winning these Nobel Prizes and everything, they are not from Africa. They are defining Africa within the Western lenses. They are defining Africa on standards and values that are not African based, or they are not from Africa. I mean, you have said it very well. When you look at the source of information that we are relying on, we are relying on information from Al Jazeera, from Reuters, from AFP, CNN, BBC. These are all Western and European medias, and they define issues on Africa and also at the world level within their own lenses. These are not, African lenses. So they influence and, direct what they want the world to see and know. And the question really remains, where is African agency? How can Africa reposition itself to, also come and, influence these narratives? And people at the end of the day, they are going to take this as the knowledge that this is what Africa is all about. This is what the common sense has decided as common. And if you are thinking or putting out a narrative that is different, then that is not common sense, and that is not considered as true knowledge. It will be fought and it will be taken as misinformation. And that is a very critical dilemma that we are in. Bro, how do you weigh in on these issues before I pose another different question, that before we move on from this topic?
For starters, well, it's a bit complicated because you've rightly pointed it out that increasingly we're seeing a lot of research, a lot of data about Africa being presented by the West, and the West in turn giving itself a series of accolades and rewards. But I think equally, from an African perspective, there's been a huge gap in terms of whether it is implementing the result of the research, whether it's delivering on actual public policy on the ground. There is a huge gap, and I think what this indicates more than anything is that there is a huge lack of executing capacity in Africa, because even for those things that we have data for, of course, we can't be too sure whether they're real or not, because we can't even verify most of the data, frankly speaking. But for those that we can even verify, we haven't been at the forefront of applying the results, taking the best practices to the ground. All this has been somewhat elusive to our elite, to our governing elites, and it's unfortunate. Even if there is a monopoly of data, a monopoly of methods, and a monopoly of what is acceptable as research, we haven't been able to thrive under that monopoly, and it's definitely for a lack of trying, because I don't think that we have tried to benefit from the existing system, even if we argue that it has limited propositions for us in terms of being more inclusive, including African voices and all. But because I can argue that what's best practice in Europe, what's best practice in the US, what's best practice in Asia has certain lessons in store for Africa as well. And I think there is no denying that everyone learns from the other. And I don't think it's constructive in a way to be defensive in that sense, because every culture, especially the Western culture, is quite effortless in terms of learning from other cultures. They're very good at assimilating the best parts of one particular culture. I mean, they even as far as go to make it look as if it is their culture. It's how far they go in terms of like assimilating something interesting, something strong they find in other cultures. And to the extent that exists, I don't think we should be, so to speak, very defensive. Of course, we have to safeguard our culture where fundamental values are in question, but with regards to governance, with regards to applying certain things on the ground, with regards to the speed of operations, with regards to responding to public needs, constructing huge engineering projects, there are huge lessons to be learned.
Yeah, exactly. You have brought it back home. So I am running out of time. So, but before we move towards the end, I would also wish that, because I have a very strong economic person here with us, the who loves economics, Mr. Bakpa, I can't end the broadcast without talking about a little bit of economics. So let's talk about economics. So we often hear people talk about the debt trap, and this is also a very, very strong argument when it comes to the global narratives and the hegemonic discussions between US and China. I mean, especially the debt trap is tied to China now recently when you look at the, trending and contemporary stories about the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. And almost this, we hear it coming from European and Western countries, very worried about the debt that African countries are contracting against China. But they don't talk about actually the past centuries which Africa suffered under the extraction, the robbing or robbery which happened within African countries that was committed by European countries, and of course the manipulation of African countries in terms of trade, in terms of currencies. We have had the CFA. This is mainly in Francophone African countries, where they are still using currencies that are tied up to the European currency, especially with France. I mean, these are not often talked about, but people are worried, especially from Western medias, about the debt trap that African countries are falling in with China. But they tend to forget that history that Africa suffered under the Europe and Western countries. So, Abdul, how does that economic narrative fit into the broader struggles for hegemony? How is it something to be ignored, especially the past historical part? And actually, I don't even want to call it historical because it's still ongoing when you look at the ties between Francophone and Anglophone countries. I mean, all of African countries, we may say they are independent, but to what extent? They are still tied up into that close relationship with the former European and Western countries that have a grip over Africa. But this is often not highlighted, is not given, highlight in the discussion, is overshadowed by the debt trap that Western medias and Western academicians and writers are now, the way how they are talking about China. How do you weigh into this? How does it fit into that struggle? Please, briefly, 2 minutes, weigh in on that,
Yeah.
and then, yeah.
It's like you asked me to talk about something of 2 kilometers. You asked me to cover 2 kilometers in 1 minute, which is even impossible for a jet. Yeah, but let me just comment on that. To warn Africa of debt trap, it's important. We should be conscious of how we borrow, but who is warning us? My problem is sometimes they say good advice, you take good advice regardless of who is coming from. Yeah, I think there's plenty of lessons for us to learn from us as a continent, how we borrow, how we should manage our debts. But sometimes you get to question who is really asking me to not get into a debt trap. And first place, what is even the debt trap? Of what is their definition of it? You look at, for instance, African countries, we do a lot of multilateral debt, and then we have sometimes bilateral debt between African countries, and sometimes we have the market debt. You realize that whenever most African countries are trying to restructure their debt, IMF has this good strategy where they call their loans. Every government must treat IMF loans as a preferential loan. That means that no matter the kind of economic troubles you are, you must repay IMF debt. So what does it mean? That is the actual debt trap, because if I am in a trap, I should be able to tell you that, oh, please, I beg you, right now I can't pay my debt. Give me 2 years to restructure myself and come back. That only works if the country is not IMF. So it's just preposterous for that same institution that is giving himself some kind of preferential treatment to come and tell me that this other country I should fear because they are going to put me in a debt trap. And the debt trap, I know I'm going too far, but let me just bring this part that I like. The debt trap, I'm saying that it's not China that is putting us in a debt trap. I think that the debt trap is defined in a way that is not suitable for us. And the debt trap is African ourselves putting ourselves in the debt trap. Every country needs infrastructure, right? if I can't generate enough revenue to build the infrastructure, and another country is coming, giving me the resources to build the infrastructure, then I should welcome it. You get it? But my problem has always been that how do African countries maintain those infrastructures? Because those infrastructures should be able to generate enough revenue to repay those debts. And usually the problem comes from ourselves, where we are unable to maintain those infrastructures. And so when time for repayment, when the moratorium period ends and we have to repay the debt, it becomes a big problem. We can't repay. So it's not actually China trapping up with debt. It's actually ourselves being unable to manage our things well and getting into troubles. And even when we get into troubles, China is ready to let us restructure. But IMF, who is warning us against debt trap, doesn't give us that leeway. And then you talk about histories of long terms of colonial extraction. This man, Thomas Piketty, has a good paper. I think I've already shared with you guys last semester. He talks about the colonial extraction and unequal exchange have shaped 2 centuries of North-South inequality. You look at the periods of colonization, all the resources that they were taking from Africa, no tax, they weren't buying them. What was important, the cost to those resources was just how the cost of extraction and the cost of transportation to their countries. That's it. Imagine the current world where you can just move to another country, get gold, get and whatever raw inputs you use to make cement, to come make cement and build infrastructure at zero cost. At zero cost. Just imagine how the kind of growth you are going to get. So this is how these countries were able to grow so immensely. And now we let me just put it here. I think that the debt trap is real, but I don't think that those people that are telling us about debt trap, I don't think they are the right people to tell us about what a debt trap is.
And that is the question. That is the question that I'm going to slide toward is Brook. But I think you mentioned one very important point, and this is what people are forgetting. And what you have explained, that is how developed countries developed. But you will never find this being told to people today. You will never find this being told to our policymakers. That's how countries developed. Countries never developed by opening up to other countries for trading. Countries never developed, by through all of these neoliberal policies that are being thrown to us from IMF and World Bank. Countries developed by extracting free resources from natural resources and human resources, and that's how they powered up their economies. But I mean, we have passed those ages, and that's what they will argue to us, and also throw us to us those neoliberal policies. So, briefly, I think to summarize what you have said, you have discussed how we see the Western hypocrisy in terms of these IMF, World Bank narratives that are being thrown to developing countries vis-a-vis the reality on how them countries developed. So I would like to go to Brook. Brook, what do you think? What comes into your mind when you hear Western commentators, mainly, and I think also you will see some comments on this broadcast later from Western fellows who will be arguing the same way. What do you think when you hear them worry about Chinese influence in Africa? Because I think this is a very, hot debate within the academic institutions. Many professors, many analysts, many, commentators across the media, they are worried about Chinese influence in Africa, especially from Europe and, Western countries. What do you think they are really trying to defend? What are the real motives behind they are being worried about the Chinese influence in Africa? Is there anything that they are trying to defend that is not, seen on the face value? Because I don't think that they are really worried about African countries falling into what we have just discussed with Abdul. Is there anything you think, as an analyst, that they are trying to defend from your own point of view?
Thank you, Erisa. Well, I think there is some validity in Western media's description of what the Chinese diplomacy entails for Africa. I think the validity, the very small validity, lies in the fact that, you know, China is a big country. It has its own interests, and it would be a fool's errand to deny that the Chinese are some benevolent angels trying to take Africa out of poverty. But I think they deliberately become blind when it comes to understanding that in the last 25 years, there has been a huge gap in infrastructure, and it was neither the US nor Europe that stood up to the demands of the infrastructure financing gap that existed. It was the Chinese who stepped up, and the Chinese didn't just step up in terms of money. They stepped up in terms of material. They stepped up in terms of personnel on the ground, and that today can be clearly seen in the infrastructure they've managed to build, which is a humongous achievement in and of itself. So when I hear the Western medias trying to paint China in a certain manner, in a certain picture, as, you know, having predatory instincts towards Africa, that doesn't sit quite well with me, because if African nations weren't getting that particular financing from China, they're going to be getting it either from the World Bank or the IMF, and we all know what they require. I think one thing we have to appreciate about China's foreign policy is they aren't really that much interested in pushing the free trade agenda. They aren't that much interested in pushing their foreign policy through financing. So if we're saying debt diplomacy, I think case in point would be Sri Lanka's port. I don't know if you've heard of it. The Chinese provided a huge financing to build that port, but Sri Lanka didn't have a productive economy to pay back the loans, and China is managing the port right now, trying to cover the amount that it has lent. So will this kind of things happen in Africa? Definitely. You will have certain African countries not being able to pay, but I wouldn't see it as a result of a predatory policy, a predatory debt-driven policy to, you know, enslave Africa the way the Westerners are pushing it. Because I think the certain free trade policies, certain policies from the West can be more dangerous than debt-driven diplomacy, as they would call it, from the Chinese side, because we're looking at countries devaluating their currency without having the necessary policy execution power on the ground to tame inflation, to increase exports. So you see countries, you know, committing political suicide in many African countries that ultimately leads to coups, and the region becomes destabilized. So I don't think the Chinese way of financing infrastructure is really bad, but I think it has more to do not with the Chinese, in terms of like constructing huge infrastructure, particular infrastructure is productive enough to pay back. So when you're looking at all of those loans being provided, I mean, you know, Western banks are not interested in even providing financing unless you open up your economy for their export goods. So you don't understand, it isn't for the lack of resource in part of Western countries, but rather they want to push their political agenda, and that doesn't seem to be the case. When you look at the Chinese, they couldn't care less about what's happening in Uganda. I mean, they don't care because they think, you know, that's not Chinese foreign policy. They don't want to decide who's going to come after Museveni. They don't want to decide who's going to come after Paul Biya. They're not interested in that, which I think is a good thing because they're somewhat, dictator agnostic in a way. So, but when you look at the US, they want to be everywhere and anywhere they can be, and that goes. The same goes for the Western countries as a whole. And again, I think that is their undoing, and I don't think China's diplomacy is as bad as people are making out as bad as people are making out to be, because in the past few years we've seen like debt restructuring. China has been willing to restructure debts owned by African countries, and it has shown its willingness to work with G20 countries, with Paris Club creditors. But the problem is, I don't think G20 countries are interested or are happy that they're sitting at the same table with the Chinese. They want better treatment from Africans. And in the 21st century, I think money doesn't have color. So
exactly.
You see a lot of those countries are somewhat really unhappy that they're now in equal terms, not only in equal terms, but often, the Chinese have more share of debt to African countries, to specific African countries, compared to the Western countries, and it has now become very hard for them to swallow, because those African countries have to first convince China, because China is like the prime creditor in terms of quantity. And even China nowadays has been working with countries like Kenya to offer them a way to pay the loans in non-dollar terms, giving them the chance to service their loans in a way that is comfortable and affordable to their economy, like letting them pay in yuan, because they have African countries tend to have yuan these days, because there is a huge back import and export going on between those two countries. And I don't think the Paris Club countries and Western countries are particularly happy, because the international financial architecture which they have designed seems not to be working in terms of like containing African countries and limiting their access to finance, limiting their access to choice, and putting policy instruments in one hand to negotiate finance on the other hand.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Brooke, for weighing in on these issues and bringing in a lot of perspectives from different points of view, which I absolutely agree with you. But also for our listeners and viewers, would like to also say that actually we are not trying to say whether Africa or African countries should, disabandon the Western and European ideologies and then fall for Chinese ideologies, but we are trying to see how to reposition Africa and bring in African agency. And I think this is something that we talked about a few minutes ago. We were trying to see how can we, uplift African agency, or how can we reclaim the space and try to influence the narrative and bring in African narratives, because what is happening in real life, what is happening in terms of policies that are being adopted within Africa, these are policies that are adopted on the narratives that are being developed and influenced from outside the continent. So we are trying to see how can we bring in African agents and reclaim the narratives and put Africa where it is supposed to be, not following in the footsteps of the Western hegemonic ideas or in the Chinese hegemonic ideas, but trying to redefine our own stories, trying to bring Africa out of this space and, rebuild and reclaim Africa. So as we close it up, I would like to bring it back home, and I'll go back to Mr. Bakpa, and I want you to weigh in on this. We have analyzed and talked about this masquerading hegemonic tensions between Europe, America, and China. And also, I remember later on we talked about how this is being masked as the common sense or the common knowledge that is driving the global narrative. And of course, unfortunately, you know, overshadowing African agency. What would be the African counter narratives, and not in terms of countering, in terms of just opposing, but what would be the way forward for Africa? What should Africa's kind of common sense look like? How can it be, in your own perspective? Is there anything that can be, uh, rebuilt or put forward by Africa in this sense to say that this is what will define Africa? What could that one be in terms of trying to reclaim the narrative from an African point of view? Because I think what is in the main domain now is the Western, and now of recent the Chinese narrative. What is coming out of China is what is being praised as common sense, or as the knowledge that is driving the global direction. But in this sense, is there anything that Africa proposes, or what do you think would be something different that redefines Africa, or what would you suggest in that regard? Brooke, Abdul, Mr.
Uh,
Bakpa.
yeah, let me just be
Yes.
snappy. Yeah, I think one thing I'll say first is that for things like science, we have to take it. Science is like a science. There is no alternative. But when it comes to things like social sciences, that's where I have different perspective. Like for Africa to have a narrative, we must make our people understand who we are. And how do we do that? Is by teaching our people history. Let us understand where we are from, where we are, and where we are going. Before, after high school, understand more of the UK than I did for Uganda, than I understood for Nigeria. So that shows you that we are studying the history of the people, and it tends to be this way. Whoever history you study, you tend to associate more with that person. That's why you see most people, when you ask me, I can narrate more of UK politics than I can narrate in the Ethiopian politics or that of Kenya. So it's a big deal. First of all, for us to have a narrative, we must teach our people who we are, and we should be proud of who we are. A famous thing I saw was Patrice Lumumba, the Kenyan man. He had a good lecture where he talked about this. Who are we? We must not define ourselves by the standards that are set elsewhere. The moment we begin to realize that, oh, this is who we are, that's where we'll have a narrative and people will understand us well and appreciate us. Yeah.
Exactly. You brought it back home. I think I you would also have added in the something like the Ubuntu economics. Ubuntu
Yeah.
economics. I mean, we have a lot of things which can really redefine us as Africa. Also, the concept of not profiting over people, but prioritizing people over the profits, which I think this is a more of African traditional value that is something that is very unique outside of other narratives. So I agree with you absolutely. Who we are, who are we? Before we learn about other people's history, of which they are very crucial and important, we should learn about our own history. Understand where we are coming from in order to know where we are going. Exactly. So, Brooke, over to you. I would like you to weigh in. How do you think, how can we make this kind of narrative? I mean, all of the things that Abdul has talked about, how can we drive this, for instance, into the schools? How can we drive this into the media? Because I mean, I'm talking about the school because this is where the future of Africa lies. The population estimations and projections indicate that by 2050, I think almost over 50% of the continent is going to be a youthful population. And at this point, these are people in schools. I remember we have talked about the way how our educational system is still framed in a way that it is promoting, this Western and Eurocentric ideologies. But how do you think that we can influence now the schools to change this kind of narrative? How can we also work around with the media to see that we bring in these new narratives to overshadow or reclaim the spaces and influence the narratives? How do you see this being practical and possible?
I think one would be we need more honest reporting of China, where
Mm.
China is at and what China is capable of doing, because I feel like right now most countries are, especially in the West, are in shock of China's industrial might as it exists, and you can only you imagine what most Africans see when they see Chinese. I mean, we grew up hearing, about fake, low quality manufactured goods coming out of China, but no one told us like every iPhone that everyone uses was manufactured in China. So there is a huge power in narratives and how they shape people's perception. And
Mm.
all along, everyone's talking about fake or, you know, copy things coming from China. Of course, there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of fake things coming from China, but it isn't the Chinese who are sending fake things. It's the African merchants who are going to China and selecting cheap goods to come and import, because we're seeing that China is manufacturing for the European Union, as manufacturing for the US. So I think there needs to be a huge rebalancing in terms of the media and how China is portrayed. And I don't think Chinese cities are done justice in terms of um, explaining. They're not fairly well covered by the Western media, and I think this is where the African media needs to step up and present China in its glory and glamour, so that there is another alternative to growth, which African countries can learn from.
Mm.
That aside, I think Africans going forward should also be careful, because when we look at China in the past 50 years, it's been a country that has decidedly chose the path of peace, but that hasn't always been the case. When you look at the generation that took power immediately after Mao, when you look at Deng Xiaoping, when you look at Hu Jintao, when you look at all those leaders in between, they had understood the value of peace and its instrumental capacity to lay a conducive ground for development. So one thing they've tried to avoid in the past 40 or 50 years is to get into a conflict with neighboring countries. But with all new generations, you have this entitlement, you have this growing need to be assertive, you have this burning need to be um, dominant, globally renowned, just like the US. And that also has to do with the fact, if you've tried to look into the data, the sex ratio in China is highly skewed towards male, by the way. In the last 3.5 decades, due to the one-child policy, China's sex ratio has been somewhat diluted. So normally you have 100 female to 105 males upon birth, and due to birth and other factors, the sex ratio should have been balanced. But due to the one-child policy, you had a lot of selective abortion. So you had people giving birth, conceiving females, and ultimately aborting female uh, children so that they can have male children. So what you end up having is a lot of male children compared to the female population. So this in return would lead to militarization. It would push into nationalistic tendencies, and I think um, Lee Kuan Yew, especially in the early 2000s and in the early 1990s, noticed this huge shift in Chinese appetite for not exactly violence, but for being assertive in the world stage in a way in which the old guard wasn't. So when you're looking at Xi Jinping, he is from an older generation, so he understands. He has gone through the cultural revolution. He has gone through. He has spent. He's been through really traumatic experiences, so you can understand that he is not really interested in this world domination, world war kind of projects, because he understands the value of peace. But I think Africa should also be careful, because I think everyone is out there for themselves, and it's going to take time. But I'm quite sure when a country starts growing, there are some elements of nationalism, there are some elements of assertiveness that will spill over into the greater world. So I think Africa should position herself to not be in the crossfire, at least, and to be in a position to learn, to grab that opportunity. Now we're looking at, the US is rerouting a lot of manufacturing, rebasing a lot of manufacturing out of China. You're seeing a lot of companies moving their manufacturing from China to other countries. Now it's a good opportunity to grab that chance, because China has started becoming expensive, so companies have went to Vietnam. Now Vietnam has also been a target of US tariffs. So you see, no one is looking at Africa. So I
Exactly.
think some African countries can be the next China, but it all depends upon how we're moving. We have to move slow. I don't think it's by any chance or luck that the Chinese suddenly became successful. I think they decided that it's not really good to make noise, because we're growing. And I think, interestingly enough, the Singaporean Prime Minister had put it eloquently in his book when he explained that he was attending the Commonwealth Summit. He was the only one who he was the only one who used like um, a commercial jet, and he flew using economic plan, whereas most African leaders chose to chart a private jets, big Boeing 787 jets, to arrive at that Commonwealth Summit. And he said that I didn't want to give the rest of the world an image that Singapore was doing well, so he chose to travel like any public person would do. So I think a lot of African leaders can learn that there is a moment in time where you project strengths, where you project your capacity, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think what we need more from our leaders is to work in the background, and to rise to the occasion.
Beautiful, beautiful. You just said it very well. I mean, this is a Brook's show. You really turned it into a Brook show, but you said a lot of interesting points, and you kind of summarized up everything that we have discussed throughout the conversation. And I really like it. I just want to build on it and say that, I mean, one time Sankara said that he who feeds you controls you, and I think this has been central to our discussion. I have a feeling that not until Africa feeds itself, or also tries to feed the world, that's when it will try to control the narrative. Because I mean, China, US, and all these countries, they feed the rest of Africa and the rest of the world, and I think that's why they control us. But also, I think we might need to add that he who tells your story defines you, because they are telling our story and then they are defining us. So these are all very trajectory and very interesting aspects that Africa needs to watch out. But just to build on what you guys have suggested in terms of the way forward, I also have a feeling that Africa, especially our governments and all the concerned stakeholders, we need to fund African research, because it also goes back. I think Mr. Bakpa will agree with me. Those who gives you the money to do the research, they will set conditionalities on how your research should look like, and it will also have an impact in terms of what you put outside there. So also we should learn to celebrate our own thinkers when it comes to our academia. we try to undermine, and not until someone quotes certain scholar from outside of the continent having talked about this and that, then they will respect their research. No, we need to celebrate our own. We need to celebrate our own cultures in terms of music and cinema. All of these are telling our own stories, but unfortunately, they are not given the space that they should deserve. We need to build African platforms to promote our own values and cultures, to sell them to the world. That's what I believe. So as we close in, I want to catch you off guard, you guys. I want to do something fun with you. I would like us to do a quick kind of game. I'll give you a phrase and you respond just in one sentence. I mean, this is off guard, but I'm just trying to play around with your mind. But I'm very hopeful that it will just going to be fun. I'll give you a phrase, just one, and then you respond in one sentence. So, Mr. Bakpa, we
Mr.
go.
Brook.
No. Brooke, let me leave him to catch the breath. He has been talking for the past few minutes. So I'll start with Mr. Bakpa. I'll
Okay.
give you just one phrase, and then you just respond in one sentence, you know. So the first one uh, is aid, and just respond in one sentence. Aid. If I say aid, how can you respond in context of our conversation that we have had?
Addictive and must be wiped away.
Addictive, and it must be wiped away. All right. Okay. We move on to Brooke. Brooke, I'll give you a phrase. Uh, democracy promotion.
Should I make a
I
sentence with
think,
it? Or
yeah. How
or
can
should
you
I
respond in the context of our discussion? If I would say democracy promotion, how can you
I
contextualize it? Yeah.
I think I would be skeptical if I hear democracy promotion. I would be very skeptical because the very idea democracy needs promotion um, is counterintuitive.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you all got it spot on. I think going back to Bakpa, I think I also agree. It's just aid is just like a mask of dependency, which African countries have been thrown into. So I'll totally agree with you if you say that that's something we need to do away with. And also, Brooke being skeptical about the promotion of democracy. I mean, yeah, because promoting democracy in kind of a universal way is something that is also problematic, because this is a model that is sourced from outside, and it's not something that you can just promote all of a sudden to all societies, considering the diversity, especially within an African context. So back to you again, Abdul. If I mention to you in this context of our conversation and I say China in Africa, what could be your response or your feelings about it? China in Africa.
Is a new girlfriend, but must be treated with caution.
A new girlfriend,
And
but
must be
should
treated with
be
caution.
it must
Yeah.
be with conscience. Okay, okay, interesting. So yeah, I mean, absolutely amazing, because yeah, is a new girlfriend, and I think that matches very well when people look at China as kind of an opportunity. Everyone is celebrating China is coming to Africa, opening up of the big market. I would closely relate it to the concept of a guy who has just got a new girlfriend. But
Yeah.
again, yeah, the other side of it being that you said to treat it with consciousness.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it also matches and goes back to what we have discussed and said that we need to, China presents its partnership as kind of a mutual beneficial but this is something that we need to negotiate. As I said before, that we are not saying that we are going to do away with the Europe, we do away with the Western countries and end up in the hands of China and recently Russia. But this is something that we need to also approach with urgency, ensuring that we are not, getting out from one trap and falling into another trap. So we need to be conscious about it. Very intelligent people. Back to you, Brooke. If I would mention to you the concept of Pan-Africanism, what would be your response in this context?
I think it would be looking for shared prosperity, shared opportunities, shared negotiating power, shared engagement with global powers, and trying to get most for our fellow African brothers.
Exactly. I see Mr. Bakpa nodding. I think he absolutely agrees with you. I would also say that this is something that is an unfinished revolution, because Pan-Africanism goes back to the roots of our forefathers who fought for our independence, and they fought for Africa to be independent, Africa to find its way out, as you have mentioned all of those concepts. So it is something that is unfinished. It's something that we pursue every day, and it is something that we should agitate for our leaders to keep on pursuing. So I enjoyed having you guys sharing into your wisdom, and also I appreciate the fact that you were such a brave to talk about these very interesting issues. And for our listeners and viewers, I would like to say that it has been a pleasure to share with you the powerful stories that we have talked about, the persistent hegemony between US and China, but also the right for Africa to define its own way out of all of these contextual issues. And the main takeaway which I can draw from our discussion for today, I would say that if we don't tell our story as Africa, someone else is going to tell it. And if they tell the story not from our own perspective, they will tell it the way they want, and they will sell their own ideology on top of our own. And of course, this is something that will haunt us for the rest of our upcoming generations. As there is this famous African proverb which says that until the lions learn to tell their story that glorifies them, the hunters will always tell the story the other way around, which glorifies the hunter. So the lion will always be portrayed as a sleeping giant animal in the jungle, and the hunter will present themselves as the bravest of the jungle because they have hunted down the lion. So we need to wake up, tell our own story as Africa, but also being skeptical, because those hegemonies are not seated as you have been saying. So they will try their own best to counteract our narratives, but we need to stay strong and follow all the recommendations that have been suggested by this intelligent man, Mr. Brook. It has been a pleasure, Mr. Bakpa. It has been a pleasure. I don't know if you have any closing remarks that you feel that are burning that you would want to share with us before we break off.
Yeah, I think I have one very simple thing to add.
Yes,
I think
bro.
it's an observation I had like a month ago. I was looking at an interview by a famous demographer, and he was explaining the, impending or potential conflict between the US and China, and he asked a very interesting question that stuck with me, and I want to share it with all of you as well. So what he said was, in the past 30 or 40 years, China has been following this one-child policy. So he's of the opinion that conflict, worldwide conflicts between the US and China is unlikely because China does not have the appetite for it. Because most of the military officers in China are only children. They are only one to their families. So in the event of a briefly prolonged conflict, he explained that it's unlikely that the Chinese public would stomach a protracted conflict, because all those children grew up being jewels of the family as an only child. So I mean, it really struck with me in a way, that can be indicative of things to come. But also, as I mentioned earlier, having a male skewed sex ratio is also a recipe for the conflict. So it's something to keep in the back of our head, and I wanted to share this with all of you.
Thank you so much, Brook, for
Thank you,
sharing.
Brook.
Mr. Bakpa?
Yeah, I think I'm all good next time.
Next time, sure. Thank you, Brook, for sharing that powerful ideology with us, and I think it will stick with us and all the viewers. So thank you so much. Thank you guys for joining. So until next time, let's keep thinking, let's keep questioning, and let's keep the spirit of Pan-Africanism alive despite the waves outside there. So this is something that we need to do for our own generation and the future generation. The revolution is unfinished, so we need to keep on. And the future, I must say, is bright. The road will not be smooth, but unfortunately, we have to move it. As Brook has been saying, it will not happen overnight. And as rightly put forward by Mr. Bakpa, we need to sacrifice our generation for the future generations of our continent to thrive in this competing global atmosphere. Thank you, guys. So we can end it from here.
Bye.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Erisa.
Thank you.